And thanks everybody for being here during National Pollinator Week. We're doing this web series for the whole month of June, but this week in particular, there's a huge focus on pollinators across the whole country. So thanks for tuning in. This is week 4 of this pollinator web series. And we're really excited to have Carol Davit, who's the executive director of the Missouri Prairie Foundation, here to talk with us about the habitat needs of various pollinators here in Missouri. She's going to focus on prairies and also give us some resources for how we can create our own pollinator habitat on our properties and backyards. So I'll keep it short and sweet. Thank you, Carol, for being here, and we'll turn it over to you for your presentation.
Thank you very much, Jake, and thank you, Colton. I appreciate being invited, and yes, happy National Pollinator Month and Week to everyone. And what a lovely week we are having in Missouri so far this week. The Missouri Prairie Foundation is a 55-year-old conservation organization and land trust. We protect prairie through a number of means, including acquiring it and managing it year-round. Our prairies are open to the public to enjoy, and I'll share more about that later. We also run the 21-year-old Grow Native native plant marketing and education program, and we administer the Missouri Invasive Plant Task Force. Oh, let's see here. What is going on here? Sorry. Not sure why this is not advancing. I guess I just have to click. Sorry about that. So my topic is pollinator habitat, and I am going to focus on prairie and other native grasslands. Of course, there are native pollinators in all different habitat types in Missouri, and I'm going to focus on prairie and other native grasslands. So first, what is prairie? It's a complex native grassland ecosystem dominated by perennial warm season grasses. So those are grasses that are going to be maturing in the hottest part of the summer, like big blue stem and Indian grass and little blue stem. So they're going to be flowering and setting seed in the hottest part of the summer. And also many broadleaved plants, and by that I mean legumes like tick trefoil and many wildflowers, also sedges, rushes, and scattered shrubs, and up to 10% tree cover. There are thousands of insects and other invertebrates, including 450 insect pollinator species and dozens of vertebrate animals. There's also tremendous complexity and function below ground. In a prairie, 1/3 of the biomass is above ground and 2/3 is below ground, which is the reverse for forest ecosystems. And these deep, complex roots are very important for slowing and absorbing stormwater. They also provide habitat for the most diverse microbial communities on Earth. And the reason I mention this is there is a correlation between the diversity of soil microbes and plant diversity. There was a study done in 2012 that documented this, that the greater number of species of plants, the more complex and abundant and diverse the soil microbes are. And of course, it is pollinators that are facilitating pollination and fruit and seed set to perpetuate prairie vegetation. So they're all working together. So and there may be things about soil microbes that determine other things about why we find pollinators in original prairies and why we might not find them on the same plants in planted prairies. I don't know. We had 15 million acres of prairie up until the time of statehood in 1821, and today we have fewer than 51,000 scattered acres remaining today. That's less than 0.5% of original unplowed prairie left. And of course, why do we have so little left? Millions of acres of row crops were created on those deep, rich prairie soils. And we also have an estimated 14 to 17 million acres of tall fescue planted in our state now, where there once were prairies or open woodlands, bottomland forests. So much of our prairie was converted to agriculture. And this happened 100 years ago or earlier, but also it's happening recently in the time period of 2008 to 2016. About 1.3 million acres of grassland and prairie have been converted to cropland in the northern Corn Belt. We also, places where we live, neighborhoods are dominated by lawn and non-native ornamental plants. Places where we shop, do business, there's not a lot of pollinator habitat. But our native grasslands are incredibly important for pollinating insects. And I used the term prairie and native grasslands earlier, and I want to explain what I mean by native grasslands. Native grasslands is kind of an umbrella term that includes original unplowed prairie, for example, Missouri Prairie Foundation's Linden Prairie that you see here. So none of these plants were planted by people. These have evolved here and been here for thousands of years. So original prairie is a type of native grassland. Glades, which are like mini deserts or really dry prairies within an open woodland context, that's another kind of native grassland. Original savannas, that's basically prairies with up to 30% scattered trees. That's another kind of native grassland. And another kind of native grassland are planted native grasslands. They're not the same or nearly as complex as original prairie, but plantings are critically important. They provide important habitat for many pollinating insects, as well as grassland birds and other grassland species. And this particular planting, this used to be a fescue field. So look how lovely and diverse that is now. So what do pollinating insects need in terms of habitat? They need three things, which is basically what we need as well. They need shelter. They need a stable, intact place to nest. They also need places to rest, to warm up, to take cover from storms. They need food. Bees need nectar and pollen. Some bees are pollen generalists, meaning they visit many different kinds of plants from which they gather pollen and nectar. Others are specialists. The term oligolectic means bees that feed on pollen from only one genus of plants. Sorry, that says plants, it's supposed to say plants, like the poppy mallow bee. It feeds on different species of poppy mallow. Whereas monolectic bees feed on pollen from only one species of plant, like the blue sage bee and the blue sage plant. It's the only plant that it's a pollen specialist on that plant. Butterflies, moths, and some other insects that pollinate, they need nectar, and they pick up pollen while they're visiting flowers to nectar on those flowers. Butterflies and moths also need native host plants on which their larvae, their caterpillars, can feed. And all of these pollinating insects also need safety. They need a poison-free environment, meaning no insecticides. Now, as there's more interest in pollinators and there's more studies, that's wonderful. But I would like to ask that you think carefully about these different concepts or terms when you're learning about pollinators and reading studies, is to think about the difference between flower visitors, pollinator abundance, and pollinator diversity and conservation. So someone say, wow, this plant is great for pollinators. It's just covered with bees. Well, let's look there. How many different species are there? Is there just one species? Is there two? Are there a lot of different species? So abundance and diversity are two different things. And it's important when we're thinking about conservation of pollinating insects that we really think about diversity as well as abundance. There may be insects visiting a flower, but they may not be pollinating it. They might be there to ambush a pollinator. They might be a predator that's going to eat a pollinating insect. So it's really important to think about these terms, because a flower visitor doesn't necessarily mean that it's a pollinator. And having a lot of bees on a plant, that might indicate abundance. It might indicate diversity as well, but it's just important to think about those things. And if we want to conserve as many different kinds of pollinating insects as possible, which I think we all do, we need to think about conserving as many original remnant habitats as we can, because there are many species that occur on those remnant habitats, like remnant prairies, that simply will not occur anywhere else. In the photo, this photo is a blue sage bee that, as I mentioned before, feeds only on blue sage. If you plant blue sage in your backyard, you probably will never see this bee, because it has only been found on blue sage on original prairie. Only one time to my knowledge has it been found on a prairie planting, but that was next to a remnant. So these are just terms to keep in mind. You have probably seen this quote by Aldo Leopold, considered by many as the father of conservation, in United States anyway, to keep every cog and every wheel is the first precaution of intelligent tinkering. So if we want to save every cog and every wheel, every kind of plant, every kind of pollinating insect, it's really important to think about species conservatism. Also, another term that I actually like better is remnant dependent species. There are different native species of plants, animals, that respond differently to changes and alterations of the landscape. Some can tolerate significant impacts. They're generalists, like ragweed. It can occur in an original unplowed prairie, and it can, it can be in a ditch, going down the highway. Others are restricted to site conditions that are more closely aligned with pre-European American settlement, like original prairies. And this is from Ladd and Thomas. So here's kind of an illustration or an example of this. So there are grassland species, and then there are prairie dependent species. So take the insect on the left. It's a buckeye butterfly, very beautiful, very much a part of prairies. It's a grassland species, though. It is not dependent on original prairie. I have it. I've seen it on prairies. I see it in my backyard in Jefferson City. The regal fritillary, on the other hand, in Missouri occurs only on original unplowed prairies. So if we want to save the regal fritillary, we need to save original remnant prairies. The buckeyes are going to do okay because they're found in other places too. And I wanted to just show here a little bit more about the complexity of saving some of these rare pollinating species. So these photos depict the life cycle of the regal fritillary butterfly. Now, many butterflies, they're out there collecting nectar. That's why they're there. They're not actively collecting pollen, but pollen will get on their bodies and they can transfer it. So they do play a role in conservation, in pollination, but not to the extent that bees do. And we'll get into that in a moment. But here are the eggs, the caterpillar feeding on its only host plant, which are 3 different species of prairie violets, and the chrysalis, and then it emerges as an adult like around June, and they're flying around now. Well, if for these caterpillars to be able to find these violets, it's important to burn at least part of a prairie so they can find these low-growing plants. But the caterpillars overwinter as caterpillars. So you can't burn the whole prairie or you'll kill all the caterpillars. So you have to burn, but not too much. So this just illustrates kind of the management challenges for some of these rare insects and other pollinators on original prairies. So getting into a bit more on pollination. So, sorry about that. Let me go back. So pollinators, so more than 85% of flowering plants require an animal, mostly insects, and most importantly, bees, to move pollen. And in Missouri, the most important kinds of pollinating insects are butterflies, bees, flies, beetles, wasps, and moths, and also hummingbirds also pollinate some things too. And so a bit about our native bees. There are about 3,600 species of native bees in the United States, about 450 in Missouri, about 200 of which are on our prairies, 5,000 species in North America. Of all of these pollinating insects, bees are the most efficient because they're actively collecting and transporting pollen to provide for their young, and also because they exhibit a behavior called floral constancy, meaning that even if they're generalists, even if they will feed on pollen from many different kinds of flowers, in a single foraging trip, they tend to visit only the same kind of plant on that one foraging trip. So they're transporting the same kind of pollen to the same species of plant. And that's important, otherwise nothing would ever get pollinated because you need to have like pollen on the like plant. But it's not exclusive. Sometimes they will visit more than one in one foraging trip. So the native bees in Missouri are solitary nesters, so they're not in colonies like honeybees are. So native bees, nearly 70% nest underground. You might find their nests in turf, but more likely in bare exposed ground like what you see here. And this is a really cool cross section to see their chamber, their nest chamber, and they can even line these with a kind of wax that can help resist flooding, which is really cool. And they're developing in the course of a year. So when I talked about they need stable, intact places for shelter and nesting, what happens if this gets plowed up? What if pesticides are poured into here, or this is, concreted over? That's obviously not going to help them. So about 30% of native bees are tunnel nesting, meaning that they nest in tree stumps or these pithy stems. Like if you break open a blackberry stem, you'll see it's real pithy inside, or a hollow stem. And so they need this to be standing for a year because their eggs are developing in there. The eggs and larvae are developing over the course of a year. So that's also what I mean by stable and intact habitat. Bumblebees so we have 45 species in the United States, 10 native bumblebee species in Missouri, and they are social and they're in colonies, and they also will nest in cavities. And of course, this is probably a repeat from other presentations, but of course, in addition to perpetuating the natural world as we know it, pollinating insects are essential to our health as well, as Whole Foods Market demonstrated by showing their produce section with bee pollinated crops and then removing all of the bee pollinated crops to show what an impact there would be to our lives if we did not have bees. So we depend on pollinators, but they don't just show up when we need them. They have to have habitat. And as I mentioned, there are more species of pollinating insects on prairies and other native grasslands than any other habitat type in Missouri. So we have to invest in pollinator habitat. We must conserve remnant prairies. They are the least conserved, most threatened major terrestrial community on Earth. Prairies in Missouri and other temperate grasslands of the world. Their ecological complexity is irreplaceable. It's incredibly important habitat for pollinating insects. And even though they've been dramatically reduced, they're still really vital habitat for many pollinating insects. For example, we for a while owned an 8-acre piece of land in the city of Joplin, and it had a 3/4 of an acre original prairie on it. And on that 3/4 of an acre was a bee species, Andrena beemeri, I think it was, that it was a specialist on Coreopsis, which is this yellow flower you see here, that had that most bee specialists have never seen, and the male had never been described by science. So even if you have a small area, it can still be really important for many pollinating insects. So the work of the Missouri Prairie Foundation is to protect original prairie and sustain its biodiversity for pollinating insects and many other species. And these are the prairies that we presently own. We actually will own 3 more by the end of the month. And we just bought one over here in Scott County, a sand prairie, on June 1st. And these are open to the public to enjoy at any time. And so again, the brown is original unplowed prairie, but today, there's so much less, so dramatically so. And so these prairies are really important because they're providing vital habitat, but they're also important because they're rich with native plants that are the sources of seeds for the native plant industry. And they're critical for creating pollinator habitat. We have to have these seeds. Here's another prairie landscape in northern Missouri, and just some of the plants from which seeds are collected for us to enjoy, prairie gardening in our yards or creating larger acres of prairie habitat. And these remnants are a guaranteed seed source. Mervyn Wallace is the owner of Missouri Wildflowers Nursery, told me that production fields for native seed collection can fail. Original prairie remnants and ones that are managed well are the only guaranteed seed source. So the amount of natural habitat on our landscapes, whether they are a remnant and also ones that we create, have a direct influence on pollinator diversity and abundance. Think about the millions of acres of roadsides that we have in the United States. So many of these could be managed differently to provide food, shelter, and other, habitat connectivity for pollinating insects. I'm sure many of you, at least those who live in central Missouri, may have seen these beautiful road cuts on 54 planted with native plants. And or seeds were spread here that are, they don't require any maintenance. They're on these rocks. They're providing for pollinator habitat, and they're really beautiful. So an example of how we could do land management on right-of-ways to benefit pollinators. Places where we live, while native landscaping grows in popularity, overwhelmingly, we see conventional plant use. All of the plants that you see here in front of this home, it's very nicely landscaped. You have a nice balance of, shapes and sizes of plants. None of these are native. These are not host plants for anything. This is like a buffet of plastic plants. But you could improve this by, you don't have to tear all of this out. You could leave this, but all this bare mulch that's not helping anything, you could put native plants in there. You could take, if you're not using this lawn, take some of it and plant, some prairie plants there. So we don't have to make super drastic changes. I mean, we do in some ways, but in a situation like this, there are things that you can do to make your existing habitat better for pollinating insects. And landscaping doesn't have to be this messy, overgrown patch of plants. It can be very formal and beautiful. Here is an example of a seeded landscape, and then closer to the house. So the house is like, up next to this beautiful place here. This is a more formal planting with plants, and then whereas this was a seeded landscape. And it's really great for pollinating insects, and it's beautiful to look at. You can do native plantings on a smaller scale. This is a prairie garden along my driveway, and this is my glade garden on the other side of my driveway. You can, this was a bare patch of dirt at my son's school, and some other parents and I created this native butterfly garden. Now, today, this is completely full. You can't see any mulch. And I would advise, we could have planted this thicker with plants to get it established quickly. Although I have to say it filled in very quickly, and it's just, incredible now. These trellises are completely full with Indian pipevine for the pipevine swallowtail butterfly. So, you just take a small patch and make an improvement. Pollinator habitat, again, you need nesting sites. So here, this has a border of these sections of log. Those are great for pollinating insects to nest in. There's a lot of different structure here. There's shrubs and, woody stems here. There's different pollinating, or flowering plants here. And, I guess resist the urge to be a super, super tidy gardener. My yard has a number of redbud seedlings in my yard. But I'll look sometimes and I will see these round circles cut in them, which is really intriguing. And those are made by the leafcutter bee. And then it takes them into its cavity nest, and it's using it for nesting material for its young. So think about your yard as not this static exterior decorating, but this place that you can make vibrant, and you can add all this ecological function to it. This is a graphic that was developed by Heather Holm and some of her colleagues. And it's a really nice graphic. We have it on the Grow Native website that shows how you can, you plant native plants in the winter, leave those stems in place. In the spring, you could cut them back 8 to 24 inches, and then native bees will be nesting in these standing stems. Then they're laying an egg on pollen balls. And in the summer, you have new growth that's hiding that stubble, so it doesn't look bad. Meanwhile, the larvae are developing. Then you have fall and winter, and the stems from the previous year, they might start to, fall over maybe eventually. But then, well, actually before that, so the bees from last year are coming out of the previous year's stems, and then you can cut the new year, the stems from the second year. And then those bees are going to emerge. Now, if you have areas where you really don't want a lot of reseeding, I can see, doing some deadheading. Just know that if you deadhead, you're going to remove seed sources for, like goldfinches. But sometimes, depending on your situation, you may want to deadhead, but do try to leave some stems standing. So again, on pollinator habitat, they need food. Here's a beautiful photo of the gardens at Twin Pines Conservation Nature Center. They need pollen and nectar. And in the case of butterflies and moths, they need host plants like the monarch butterfly caterpillar, of course, needs these. Here's 2 milkweed species that they would use. Now, when you're shopping for plants, think about, you will often find a lot of cultivars and nativars on the market that may be okay for pollinating insects, but they might not have as much pollen or nectar. It's kind of hard to know. Whereas native plants, straight species, are reliably providing the resources that pollinators need. And there are a number of plants increasingly on the marketplace that are called native, and they actually are not native. They're cultivars or nativars. So just be aware. And again, not all cultivars and nativars are bad, but if you want to be sure, I would recommend choosing native plants. And our Grow Native program has lots of resources to help you. We have Grow Native professional members who sell seed that can help you transform large landscapes into pollinator plantings. Whether on a farm, like what I just showed you, there are industries that have a lot of land around them, like wastewater treatment plant. And there's a native planting at the Bissell Point treatment plant at St. Louis. A lot of parks, greenways, if lawn is not being used, it can be transformed into pollinator habitat. Native plantings for stormwater management, such as these, are also providing habitat for pollinating insects. Oh, I already showed you that, sorry. And then at home, again, you don't have to have, you can have a really formal looking native garden that will be pleasing to you, but it will also provide habitat for pollinating insects. And we have a couple called Front Yard Formal. And this one is for full sun, and we have one for shade. And both of these designs feature plants that are a little bit more tidy. They don't spread quite as much. And so they're really nice for a formal front yard. We also just this week finalized an update to our butterfly garden. And this is available on our website, and this is beneficial for butterflies, but many of these plants would benefit bees and other kinds of pollinating insects as well. We also just today finished this pollinator garden menu card. Some of you may be very knowledgeable and you're already gardening with lots of different plants, but if you're new and it can seem kind of overwhelming, we thought this like pick 3 menu card would be helpful. And the idea is you pick 3 plants that bloom in spring, 3 that bloom in summer, and 3 that bloom in fall, so that you have something in bloom from spring to frost. And so we developed this with the St. Louis Zoo, and this is on our website as well. If you want to start a small garden, Mervyn Wallace has this in his catalog. Pick an area of turf. You can use herbicide and kill the grass, but if you don't want to do that, you cut a piece of plastic or a weed barrier. This is like in July, he did this, cover it with mulch, leave it in place for a couple of months. So he took this off in September, and the dirt, the plant, the vegetation will be dead. Do not till it. Do not till it, because you'll damage the soil structure and you'll bring up weed seeds. Then you can plant, plants into that. If you can mulch, but mulch lightly, or use large pieces of mulch. If you use super fine mulch, it creates a mat. It can encourage algal or fungal growth, and it's hard for water to penetrate, and it's hard for ground nesting bees to find the soil. So use pieces of mulch that are larger. You can also forego wood mulch entirely. Leaf mulch is really good for native plants if you can find it, or use what's called a green living mulch. Mervyn Wallace uses wild strawberries to plant between the other plants, so that they spread and they suppress weeds. And by the time your other plants have grown larger, they've shaded out the wild strawberry. It kind of disappears, but it's acted as this temporary living weed barrier. We have garden signs to help you demonstrate to your neighbors, why you're doing what you're doing. You can look for these Monarch Cafe tags when you buy plants. And we have Pollinator Buffet series of tags. Of course, there are virtually every flowering plant in Missouri is benefiting a pollinator, but these kind of help get you started. Our Grow Native resource guide, printed and online, is a listing. It's a directory of where you can buy native plants and native plant services and seeds from our professional members. And again, you know, when you do these things, you're helping pollinators, but you're also making your life more interesting. This is a favorite quote of mine by famous Missourian Dr. George Washington Carver. To those who have not yet learned the secret of true happiness, begin now to study the little things in your own dooryard. This was on a sign at a fish hatchery in Arizona. Outside my garage door, I have partridge peat planted. And these are the ripening pods. And I looked one day and I thought, well, that's not a ripening pod. That's a caterpillar. That's the cloudless sulfur butterfly caterpillar, which looks a lot like the pod. And it's its host plant. So I brought it in and to my house and let it continue feeding. It pupated and we got to see it transform into the butterfly. This is yellow passion flower, a native plant growing on my privacy fence. And this potter wasp walks around these petals, it gets pollen on its head, and it's really fun to watch. So this is about, you know, making your landscapes more alive and just really kind of joyful. So some take-home points. To conserve the greatest diversity of pollinating insects, we must protect original habitat remnants, which support many plants that may be difficult to propagate, on which many bee specialists depend. Protecting prairie remnants is also critical to conserving seed sources to create more pollinator habitat. Planted prairie may not provide for as great a diversity of pollinators as original habit, but it's still extremely important. And it can still have a diversity, it just might not have everything. Management of prairie remnants is important. Burn 1/3 to 1/2 of a tract of prairie annually, but don't burn it all. So you don't kill all of the bee larvae developing in stems or butterfly and moth larvae or pupae. If you have a large property, farms, orchards, avoid insecticides, plant natives near food crops, because those pollinating insects, well, the more nectar and pollen you have, they'll have a more robust population and they can also help pollinate your food crops. Don't get too tidy. Snags, blocks of wood, standing dead vegetation are all important for nesting spots. If you're gardening at home, plant an array of native plants so something is always in bloom early spring through late fall. Keep flower stems standing. In late fall or spring, cut back, but leave 8 to 24 inches tall stems. Don't mulch heavily, otherwise the ground nesting bees can't find the soil, and avoid using insecticides. And with that, if anyone has any questions, or I can go over more things, and I can also show you some other resources we have on our Grow Native website. So thank you.
Thanks, Carol. That was a terrific presentation with tons of good information about all the different pollinators we've got and how we can, you know, better manage our prairies and even our home habitat. So really appreciate you coming on and sharing with us tonight. And before we jump into the Q&A, I just wanted to take a second to thanks everybody for their support of the young professionals in this web series. So as we work to grow our group, and plug into the work that CFM does, we really appreciate everybody's support. For anybody who is not familiar with the young professionals yet, or maybe just tuning in for the first time, the CFM Young Professionals are a group of conservation-minded individuals between the ages of 21 and 40 who are interested in Missouri's outdoors, activities, and how we can provide opportunities for engagement, education, and networking. So if you're interested in joining the young professionals, feel free to let me know in the chat, reach out to someone on the committee, or join us on our Facebook page, and you can see what we're up to in the CFM magazine or newsletters that come out every couple of weeks. So thank you, everybody. With that, we'll pause for a second to stop the recording and move into the Q&A section.